Hello, everyone. My name is Francesco Cipollone. I'm the CEO and founder of Phoenix Security. But today, I come here with a different hat on. With the community, we're putting together a framework to help organizations getting ahead of vulnerability management from application security to cloud security to infrastructure security. We came together with several members of the industry, OWASP, and several other industry leaders in the vulnerability management space to focus on how do we get ahead on measuring the maturity level of an application security program, a vulnerability management program, when fundamentally dealing with issue, bug, vulnerabilities, call it whatever they want, but fundamentally software defect, vulnerability in software, operating system, and other assets that an organization might have. This is part of a series, so if you want to look all the way down to the original part, there are other videos that are linked here. And beneath in the comments, you can see the link to the vulnerability management framework that is available for everybody to contribute, download, use it, and let us know what you want to see next as well in the framework. The framework is in development. Right now, we have the version 1.2 out, and there is a new version coming out in the upcoming months. So without further ado, we're going to do a quick recap on the vulnerability management framework, what it stands for, what are the various areas, and then we're going to move into today the prioritization and contextualization aspect that are the next level of the cycle. So the vulnerability management framework around software application security, call it whatever they want, start with fundamentally getting all the asset, all the vulnerability in one single place. That part is called aggregation, and then deduplication and correlation is the second aspect of this process, where you take fundamentally assets from different contexts and link them together with each other to make sense of where they are, how they're connected to each other, and how they communicate with each other. The other aspect is enriching those assets, but we're going to cover the enrichment and part in the prioritization and part in the other areas. But today we want to focus on the part number 3, that is fundamentally the prioritization and the contextualization that will follow in a more in-depth video because it's quite rich aspect. And then the enrichment with threat intelligence that will come again after with the enrichment part, together with the business area. And the last part of the framework will focus more on the actionability and how to route problem and information to the team that is supposed to look and see where those vulnerabilities need to be solved. And that is quite an important part of the framework that we will focus on, together with the metrics and measurement of the framework. The framework is available in the current 1.2 version across the board, and it covers, as I said, from detection to aggregation. Where we're going to focus today is the prioritization aspect of the framework. So in the prioritization usually comes after the detection, the aggregation of vulnerability. So when you have all the assets in one single place, if possible, clean them up, or they're already cleansed, enriched with some level of form of information, and now you're ready to really focus on how to take them to the next level. Prioritizing vulnerabilities is probably the most and core part of the framework because it's super important to focus on what really matters most. And the challenge of what really matters most changes all the time depending on organization. Usually what you want to focus is vulnerability issues that are widely deployed, widely adopted, and looked after threat actor, executed and exploited in the wild with low level of complexity in terms of execution and with super high impact. For example, like Log4j, there was a remote code execution. You might want to focus on the external components that are more available for a software that don't have a compensating control like a WAF in front of it, rather than focusing on every library that you might have in your organization. And one library might be used in a piece of software, maybe it's not even code. So that is why prioritizing vulnerabilities across your software landscape, across your infrastructure landscape is so important. Now, maturity level 0 usually is where most of the organizations start, where there is no prioritization whatsoever. All the vulnerability, all the assets are of the same level. And usually that leads into noise, into chaos, where everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. Maturity level 1 is probably where most organizations starts going into the prioritizing vulnerability space after all the team gets a little bit frustrated from the sea of critical vulnerability that they have to deal with. Usually that starts with CVSS or CWSS, that are the two international standards for vulnerability severity, not risk, rating. And usually that is a starting point, and well recognized in the industry, but it's a very basic starting point, because it's been proven that a lot of the CVSS or vulnerability or CVE are actually not exploitable in the wild. So a risk-based vulnerability management approach is more effective when considering what's been exploited in the wild, if there is an easy to access exploit, the level of complexity of the exploit, and so on and so on, that we will explore in the higher level. And this is the whole purpose of the prioritization. So to look at the business context, where things are in your organization, how exposed they are, the security context, so how many compensating control are around that specific vulnerability, if it's exploitable or is it not exploitable, if the exploit level or the effort that an attacker needs to do is high, medium, or low. And depending on this rating, you can already think how to prioritize. The challenge of this is that you need to create, or you need to have an asset register. You need to have the information about the vulnerability and information about the exploit available out there. Usually those information don't come available by default on a lot of systems. So organizations need to build fundamentally that level of prioritization. That's why it's challenging. And that's why there are organizations like Phoenix Security, Defect Dojo, or a few others that help building and prioritizing vulnerability at scale with some level of prioritization. Defect Dojo is an open source project that, if you haven't tried, have a look at it. Free to use, together with Phoenix Security, where the basic license is available for everybody to use from OWASP. We also have a free tier. But coming back to the maturity framework, the maturity level 2 is probably where a lot of organizations will step into after looking at the criticality or the severity of a particular vulnerability, because it doesn't require a lot of effort in terms of insight, intelligence, asset management. So this is the natural place where a lot of organizations will go, looking at service level agreements in the particular space of application security, security in general. These are contracts that are written in policy that state how quickly specific vulnerability need to be solved by the development team or the operation team in terms of patching or software from the time of discovery. The challenge with this approach has been widely proven that fails most of the time, if not all the time. There are several studies from Gartner to other publications that specify or provide detail on why this fails. The challenge with this approach is that it's flat, and it doesn't apply the level of complexity and context that is required to really focus the work. And also, for criticality, there is a lot of high critical that are getting detected. And if you work on them in a sequence way because of the SLA says you need to fix all the critical vulnerability within 3 days. That's usually one SLA that is explained or utilized. That leaves organization fixing critical vulnerability, but at random in their organization space. A critical vulnerability like Log4j on a system that is externally exposed is probably, it should be probably looked first than a critical vulnerability that is sitting in an internal system. The challenge is with SLA, those two vulnerabilities will need to be resolved still within the 3 days. So that's when organizations start realizing SLA in itself is a guidance, is not an objective. The objective is reducing the vulnerability that matters most. And that's why they usually go to maturity level 3, where we start moving towards a more risk-based contextualization and risk-based vulnerability management approach, where several of these factors that I mentioned, where it is in the landscape of an organization, how exposed it is, what are the compensating control, all of those elements forms element of the risk, because they express the likelihood or the probability of a specific risk event to happen. And if you bring in also the business context, you start also understanding the impact of a specific vulnerability event to happen. And all of these three elements, how bad a vulnerability is, usually expressed in CVSS. What is the likelihood of an event to happen, and what is the impact, convey the sense of risk. The risk for a specific vulnerability to happen in the particular context where that asset is. The maturity level 3 usually requires system like Phoenix Security, Defect Dojo, or other vulnerability management platform that need an advanced level of context, business context, and cyber threat intelligence or probability of exploitation. This is because you need to start looking at the vulnerability in a different way, in a different level. The one on a system that is externally exposed are very, very different from the one from a system that is internally exposed. So you need a system like Phoenix Security or other open source or non-open source system to look at really where those assets are and what vulnerability affect those assets. And then the next level will be to start using cyber threat intelligence to start looking at the probability of exploitation. There is an open source framework and project that Phoenix Security supports heavily that is called EPSS, that provides the exploitability factor of a specific vulnerability in the next 30 days. There are also other cyber threat intelligence information that give you a rating from 1 to 10 or 0 to 1,000 that express how bad a specific vulnerability could potentially be. And those, together with the CVSS, start expressing the likelihood of an event to happen. So start going towards risk instead of purely severity. Now, the next step in their journey is to adopt SLA. But SLA this time not based on pure severity or not based on CVSS or CWSS, but this time based on risk. So this is the next generation of SLAs. In those SLA, you start measuring how quickly you need to solve a specific risk in the context of where the vulnerability are. Or fundamentally, SLA based on the risk of a vulnerability to happen in the context, in the business context where that vulnerability is. Where before, the same vulnerability with a criticality of level 10 was treated the same with 3 days and 3 days, for example. In this particular case, a risk of a original CVSS 10 that is exposed over the web with no compensating control and with a highly likelihood of exploit is treated very differently than for a system that is internally facing with a lot of compensating control, no external communication, and maybe with the same level of high probability of exploitation. Same vulnerability treated from with a very different level of risk, and consequently, two very different levels of SLA. What you want to look at is having a very short SLA for very high risky vulnerability, and having a more lax approach on vulnerabilities that are on the lower scale of risk. In that way, you can start focusing more on the vulnerability matters more that are more risky for the organization. And then this brings us to the maturity level 4, when we bring also the impact level of a specific system. The maturity level 4 brings fundamentally all the level of the maturity 3, but expands the risk level and the risk calculation of the vulnerability with the business context. The business context explains how dangerous or how impactful a system going down is going to be. How much data or critical data that system process. If that system is externally facing, or if that system is subject to regulation. So the organization could be impacted by a regulatory fine if that system gets compromised, or the number of users, for example, that are supporting that system. All these metadata about business can be vehiculated in terms of impact for a specific asset or a set of assets. For example, if you had a business application that process card transaction data that are heavily regulated by the PCI environment, or the PCI regulation fundamentally, having those data compromised could imply that you might lose the PCI license. It's not PCI DSS. It's not always a straightforward answer, but it might happen. Now, a parallel system that might not have the same level of critical information, or maybe the data that it processes publicly available, even if you get compromised, yes, it's bad because a threat actor might deface the system and put something that you don't want on a system that is externally facing. But because the data is not customer data, you might not be affected by GDPR or PCI DSS or other regulation. A vulnerability on a system that is highly exposed to users, process highly critical data, needs to be treated in a very different way with different level, again, of SLA than a system that process non-critical data and has less information about the user, or maybe no information at all. This is what the business context brings. How much is worth a system, how much critical data it processes, if it's affected by regulation, and so on. And the last level is fundamentally starting using those information in terms of risk, with business context, with probability of exploitation, for team OKR. An OKR is an objective that the team can achieve and strive for to measure where they want to be. And maintaining a low-risk position rather than a high-risk position, or expressing a risk level objective rather than pure vulnerability SLA objective or severity, is really the nirvana of a lot of teams. Where before we were considering in a flat way vulnerabilities that were coming from scanning system in the same way, in the same level, right now we are using different objectives. We're using a risk-based objective that can be even adopted, and organizational teams can go to production with a high-risk vulnerability, but with the objective of keeping those risks down in the next week, 2 weeks or so. Enable a much better risk-based approach of the organization rather than saying no vulnerability shall be allowed in production. It might be more counterintuitive because it means that security look and seem more lax, but sometimes having a feature that can't go to production might hurt the business, might be more risky than saying no to a particular piece of software going to production. They might have critical vulnerability that might be solved in a very immediate way. And in that way, we empower teams to prioritize vulnerability based on different level of risk and enable them to treat what to do next in terms of risk. This is the nirvana of cyber risk or risk-based vulnerability management with teams. And there are different steps of evolution as we see. I hope this was useful. This is Francesco Cipollone. Please check the vulnerability management framework, ask questions in the comments, and I hope you feel engaged and start up adopting a more risk-based approach, because this has been proven by several studies from Ghana to other industry leaders that reduce the burnout of teams and help them focus on what's really important first. And also, from a business perspective, from a security perspective, of the more risk-based approach and a risk-based view of what's available. I hope this was useful. This is part of the vulnerability management framework, operation, and project that Phoenix Security sponsors and is contributed by a lot of other industry leaders. It's an open source project in OWASP. We have a Slack channel. So if you don't, check the link in the comments to get all the information to contribute and participate in the next version. Thank you very much.
Phoenix. Fix vulnerabilities today before attackers exploit them tomorrow.